Welcome to another deep dive. This time, we're heading into some really fascinating philosophical territory. For those of you who are all about those aha moments and just really getting to the core of things quickly, we're diving into what's called African sage philosophy, a whole tradition of critical thinking that comes directly from, well, wise individuals within African communities.
Yeah, and it really challenges some of those assumptions we often make about where philosophy comes from.
Yeah.
It's not just a Western thing. This deep dive is going to show how seriously deep thinking has been happening within African oral traditions for a long time.
Right, exactly. And this whole area of philosophy, it really gained a lot of traction thanks to a Kenyan philosopher named Henry Odera Aruka. He lived from 1944 to 1995, and his main goal was to show just how much deep critical reflection was happening in African societies. If we're talking big questions, questions about what it means to exist, what makes a person, freedom, justice, even death, and what happens after.
Yeah, all those big questions.
Yeah, and a lot of what we'll be talking about today comes from Aruka's major work, Sage Philosophy: Indigenous Thinkers and Modern Debate on African Philosophy. It was published in 1990.
It's crucial to understand the context here. Aruka was directly pushing back against this historical tendency to ignore or downplay what African thinkers had to offer.
Yeah.
He wanted to show that there's real philosophical rigor in diverse African cultures.
And that's what we're hoping to do in this deep dive. We're aiming to understand what African sage philosophy really is, how it tackles those Eurocentric biases that pop up in philosophy, and what makes someone a philosophic sage. We'll be looking at some real examples and different viewpoints to, well, give you a solid grasp of the whole thing. So why don't we start by looking at Ruka's project, how he went about it and what he discovered about sage wisdom.
So Aruka's method was pretty unique. Instead of just sticking to written stuff, he actually went out and talked, really talked, with people who could considered wise in their communities. That's how he got those deep insights, those subtle nuances in their thinking.
And his book, it's got some amazing examples, like Paul Mbuya Akoko. He was from the Luo community. When Aruka asked him about communalism, the way the Luo people see it, Akoko's answer was really interesting. He said, it's not just about sharing stuff randomly. It's more like this complex system of cooperation.
Right, yeah.
And he used cattle distribution as an example. People who owned cattle would distribute them to those who didn't, but not as permanent gifts. It was to make sure everyone could, take care of the cattle and benefit from them.
That's so interesting. You see elements of sharing, obviously, but what Akoko's saying is that it goes deeper than that, right?
Yeah.
It's about this underlying principle of interdependence, sharing responsibility. It's not just charity. It's about how individuals are connected within the community. It really contrasts with those Western ideas of individual ownership.
It does, doesn't it? It shows you how much thought he put into this fundamental social practice. And then there's another example, Okemba Simiyu Chongo from the Bukusu community. Uruka asked him, what is truth? And Chongo's answer, well, it's quite insightful, I'd say. He said, when something is true, it is just as you see it. It is just what it is. Just like this bottle. It is true that it is just a bottle, just what it is. Truth is good. Falsehood is bad. It is evil. He who says the truth is accepted by good people. A liar may have many followers, but he is bad. And then when Aruka asked about why people lie, Chongo said it was for things like getting ahead, material gain, or just looking important.
Wow. That's a clear example of what we call the correspondence theory of truth. Truth matches reality, that sort of thing. Chongo's definition, it's straightforward but really deep. And then he takes it further by thinking about the ethics of truth. Why do people lie? It gets into those moral dimensions of truthfulness.
Exactly. It's not just a simple statement. It shows you he's got this abstract understanding of truth and how it ties into morality. So both Akoko and Chongo, they're really thinking for themselves, coming up with these deeply personal reflections on fundamental concepts. You can see how they can think abstractly about these big philosophical questions.
And that addresses Aruka's main concern, right? That idea that African sages weren't engaging in philosophical thought in the same way as the Greeks. These examples show clear reasoning and abstract thinking.
Which leads perfectly into our next point, how Aruka challenged those Eurocentric biases in philosophy. He was really bothered by how people dismissed traditional African wisdom as somehow, less philosophical than the ideas of the ancient Greeks.
We got to remember the historical context here. The sayings of those early Greek thinkers, they were often pretty short, metaphorical, right? But they got turned into philosophy because later philosophers wrote whole commentaries and interpretations of them. So Aruka's point was, why shouldn't the thoughts of African sages like Akoko and Chongo be seen as philosophy too?
It makes you think, doesn't it? Why the double standard? If the Greeks get credit for those early fragments, why not the African sages? Aruka was saying that what makes something philosophy in the West is writing it down and then analyzing it through commentaries. And that same process should apply to African thought, too.
It's like what Socrates did in those early Platonic dialogues, right?
Right.
He saw himself as a midwife, helping people give birth to the knowledge they already had. He wasn't the source of the ideas. He was just helping them come out.
And that's how Aruka saw his dialogues with the sages. He was providing what he called a philosophical catalyst. The sages already had the insights. He was just helping them articulate them.
Yeah, it's key to understand that Aruka wasn't saying he was creating philosophy in these sages. He was just facilitating its expression, documenting it. He recognized that they already had this philosophical capacity within them.
And he also said that the other way philosophy develops in the West, critically examining and debating earlier thinkers, that should happen with African sage philosophy too. He was really hoping that trained philosophers, no matter their background, would engage with the sages' ideas, analyze them, debate them. He saw that as essential for knowledge to grow. Even Aruka himself knew the sages' ideas weren't supposed to be accepted blindly.
That's the beauty of philosophy, right? It's not just about making statements. It's about that ongoing process of critiquing, interpreting, engaging with ideas.
Now, another big claim that Aruka tackled was this idea that you need literacy for philosophy, that oral traditions just can't produce it. This was a huge bias back in colonial times, wasn't it?
Huge. They just dismissed unwritten thought as non-philosophical. But Aruka, he challenged that head on. He talked about how amazing memory is, how structured thought can be within oral traditions. He argued that African thinkers could be just as reliable and organized as written records.
And to those who said that Africa started philosophy late because they didn't have written records, he said that was unfair. It's like limiting where we look for philosophical activity just because it wasn't written down.
But at this point, it did get some pushback. Like philosopher Peter Bodenrin, he made a distinction between someone just thinking philosophically and the kind of systematic, organized reflection you see in established philosophical traditions. He questioned whether Aruka had shown that African philosophers were really doing that kind of deep, systematic analysis of their culture.
Right. And Aruka had a response. He acknowledged the distinction, but then laid out his own framework. He said there are four main trends in African philosophy: ethnophilosophy, nationalist ideological philosophy, professional African philosophy, and of course, sage philosophy. And he argued that all of these represent different ways African thinkers have systematically explored the fundamentals of African life. He was saying that philosophy wasn't limited to universities or written texts.
He also recognized that African philosophy itself was diverse. He wasn't saying sage philosophy was the only valid form. He saw it as one important and distinct approach.
He was actually critical of some professional African philosophers, too. He felt they were almost repeating the same European biases he was fighting against. They were denying that traditional African thought could be systematic just because it wasn't written down. He saw that as a real underestimation of how important reason is in African societies.
Right. Aruka was arguing that reason is just part of being human. You need it for any society to function and grow. To say that Africans didn't use reason in their traditions, he thought that was just illogical and wrong.
And about the whole written philosophy thing, Aruka said that being a philosopher shouldn't depend on writing stuff down or even having continuous commentary over generations. He said that while systematicity is important for rigorous thinking, you don't need literacy for it, and neither do you need it to preserve thought. He pointed out that preservation often happens through oral transmission, but it's selective, it's guided by what the community values and wants to remember.
That takes us to another claim Aruka tackled: the idea that African traditions enforce philosophical conformity and discourage individual thought. This is where ethnophilosophy comes in.
Right, yeah. Ethnophilosophy. This term got popular largely because of Paul Nhamtanju's critique. He was very critical of thinkers like Placide Tempels and his idea of Bantu philosophy. Nhamtanju argued that ethnophilosophy presented African philosophy as this anonymous collective system, no individual thinkers.
Nhamtanju was pointing out the problem of portraying African philosophy as this one big shared worldview, like everyone agrees. It created this false image of everyone thinking the same way across all these different African cultures.
And Aruka, he was really worried about that. He felt it prevented people from seeing individual critical thinking in African traditions, and he also pointed out how sometimes this idea of forced unanimity was actually reinforced by post-independence political systems that couldn't tolerate any opposition.
Yeah. It's like shutting down any kind of dissent, right?
Exactly. So Aruka's Sage Philosophy Project directly challenged this idea of unanimity. By showing those dialogues with individual sages, he was presenting evidence of diverse independent thought. He was saying that while those in power might want everyone to conform, real thinkers thrive on exchanging ideas and considering different viewpoints.
Like we were saying earlier about philosophy, it's about the debate, the back and forth.
Absolutely. And he made a clear distinction between sage philosophy and ethno-philosophy. For him, sage philosophy focused on those distinct, rationally argued ideas of individuals, separate from what he called anthropological fogs, the more general communal myths and beliefs.
So he wanted to isolate those individual voices, pull them out from the general cultural landscape. He disagreed with thinkers like Franz Crahe, who said that Africans needed to make some kind of qualitative mental leap to be able to think philosophically. Even Hontonji disagreed with that. He said local knowledge systems were already distinct from myths.
And Kwasi Wiredu, another big name in African philosophy, he added to this by pointing to the critical thinking and debates that happened among elders in Okan communities. This showed that knowledge wasn't just anonymously shared, it was created through discussion and weighing different viewpoints.
So critical thinking and considering different perspectives were built into a lot of traditional African knowledge systems.
Right. And this brings us to some specific examples of these independent thinkers. Uruka emphasized that they base their ideas on a critical look at their own experiences. One great example is Shaban bin Robert, a Swahili poet, critic, and philosopher from Tanzania. He's a good example of someone bridging those oral and written traditions.
Yeah, Shaban bin Robert is fascinating. He moved between those two worlds really well. And his writing, it's full of philosophical insights.
In his work, Utubora Mikunima, he really developed this concept of the ideal person. He argued that true morality is about being a responsible member of your community, putting the group's well-being ahead of your own individual interests.
That idea of personhood being tied to the community, it comes up a lot in African philosophy, and Shaban bin Robert gives a really compelling take on it.
Then, in Kusadikika, he talked about a just society. He said it's one where everyone is treated equally, where everyone's basic rights are respected, no matter their gender, age, social status, any of that.
Those are definitely liberal ideals. It shows that indigenous thinkers weren't stuck in some unchanging traditional worldview. Shaban bin Robert was engaging critically with both indigenous and modern ways of life.
Exactly. And Uruka saw thinkers like him as proof that you can be indigenous and still be a rigorous, critical thinker. It breaks down that false idea that being indigenous means you just conform intellectually.
So we've looked at these examples and how Uruka challenged those biases. How did he define sage philosophy itself?
So for Uruka, sage philosophy is basically the expressed thoughts of wise men and women in a community. He saw it as a spectrum, going from that widely accepted popular wisdom, those common proverbs and understandings, to what he called didactic wisdom, which is the more thought out, reasoned ideas of specific individuals.
And what's interesting is how he emphasized the rational thought of some given individuals. It wasn't just about collective wisdom, it was about individual reflection.
And he had a specific way of figuring out who was a philosophic sage. A key thing was they had to be dissatisfied with the norms, those commonly held beliefs. These are people who would question and re-examine things instead of just accepting them.
That critical stance is what sets the philosophic sage apart.
Yeah.
They're not just repeating what they've been told, they're thinking it through for themselves.
Exactly. Philosophic sages, they want rational explanations, justifications. They don't just follow customs blindly. That makes them sources of new knowledge and potential agents of change in their societies. Think about Mbuya's definition of communalism. He wasn't just repeating what everyone did, he was offering a reasoned explanation, clarifying the concept based on a moral principle.
And that leads to the distinction between philosophic sages and what Uruka called folk sages. Folk sages are like the keepers of tradition and belief. They can explain those beliefs really well, but they don't necessarily question them or give independent reasons for them.
Uruka's example of a folk sage is Ogo Temeli from the Dogon community. Marcel Grial documented Ogo Temeli's knowledge of Dogon cosmology and astronomy. It was incredibly detailed, but Uruka argued that his individual voice as a thinker got lost in the communal expression. He was mainly presenting shared knowledge, not his own reflections.
Uruka also considered the Onisgun, the Yoruba sages, studied by Hallen and Suripo, to be folk sages. They knew a lot about Yoruba thought, but their main role was to explain those established beliefs, not to critique them.
And this brings up some interesting methodological challenges. Like, imagine a philosopher looking at W.V.O. Quine's indeterminacy thesis of radical translation. How do we even know if we're getting the concepts right when we're translating across such different languages, especially when we're talking about complex philosophical ideas?
Right. Quine's work shows how hard it is to translate perfectly. There's always a chance of misinterpreting things when you're trying to map concepts from one language and culture to another, especially if they're very different. Hallen, based on Quine, said that sometimes what seems like inconsistencies in non-Western thought might actually be because of translation problems, not because the original thought itself is irrational.
And Aruga, he was really worried about forcing Western philosophical frameworks onto indigenous African thought. He thought it could create a big gap between people inside the tradition and those outside trying to understand it. He even questioned if there could be a true language of African philosophy if we keep applying Western ideas.
So it begs the question, what did Oruka think the relationship should be between these indigenous philosophic sages and philosophers trained in the Western tradition?
That's where it gets a bit complicated. He valued the sages' insights and wanted them to be recognized, but he was cautious about just applying Western frameworks to African thought. He was afraid it would lead to indigenous ways of thinking disappearing.
That connects with Kwasi Wiredu's idea of conceptual decolonization. Wiredu said, African philosophers have to be really aware of the influence of Western thought and be careful about how they use their own indigenous concepts in their work.
Wiredu, he understood Uruka's concerns about imposing Western thought, but he also agreed with others that African cultural beliefs and customs needed to be critically examined. He wasn't saying just accept tradition blindly. He was saying engage with it thoughtfully.
So it's about finding that balance,
Yeah,
really.
finding that balance. And Uruka, ultimately, he seemed to think that professional philosophers and philosophic sages could have a productive relationship, but each needed to be able to develop on their own. He wanted to expand what we see as legitimate philosophy, go beyond just the Western academic world.
And the impact of sage philosophy, it's still relevant today, in post-colonial thought. Thinkers like Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak have talked about how we need to stay aware of those Eurocentric impositions, even now.
And it's fascinating to see how philosophers like Weirdu, Hallen, and Sudipo, even though they might have different methods, they all share that basic idea with Uruka. That African philosophy emerges when Western-trained philosophers start asking critical questions about indigenous beliefs and languages. They're suggesting that both indigenous sages and professional philosophers can be considered philosophers. So to wrap things up, African sage philosophy, as Aruka presented it, it really highlights this tradition of critical thinking that's been alive in African communities for a long time. It directly challenges those old biases that dismiss non-Western thought and shines a light on the important contributions of individual African sages. And that difference between philosophic sages who give reasons for their views and folk sages who mainly pass on communal wisdom, that's a key part of understanding Uruka's work.
And for our listeners out there who are into philosophy, we hope this deep dive has given you a good, solid understanding of this complex and rich area of philosophy, maybe sparked some of those aha moments and given you some new ways of looking at philosophical inquiry itself.
And speaking of new ways of looking at things, here's something to think about. With all these conversations about cultural influence and how the very definition of philosophy is always changing, what role might traditions like African sage philosophy play in shaping global philosophical discourse in the future? It's something worth pondering, and maybe it'll lead you to explore the work of Aruka and those other thinkers we've talked about.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it sparked your curiosity and inspired you to explore further.